There is a whole aspect of all of this that sometimes escapes the law itself. This is the whole question of the relationship that humans can have with animals or with plants. There is a whole field of research and a field of lived and real experiences that does not pass through the mill of the debate.
If we're going to move to much more industrialized food production in the laboratory, then it has huge implications. The farmer ceases to be this central figure.
There was a German nature reserve study where they looked at insect populations over the last 25 years, and it's declined by 75%, even in the German nature reserves. If we want to preserve nature and farm separately from nature, the decline in biodiversity and the sixth extinction will continue.
Hey everyone, I'm Theo.
And I'm Alex, and we're the hosts of Prophets, Wizards, and the Quest to Value Nature.
Welcome to Foodlands. So in the last episode, we looked at where the money is flowing to support better valuing biodiversity and natural resources in our food system. But people's relationship with animals and plants in our foodlands is shaped by their relationship to nature in general, whether that's as consumers, farmers, tourists. In the West, we really do care about nature in lots of different ways.
We do, Theo, but perhaps it's easier to care about nature than to define what it is.
Yes, I think we should say to listeners that we are using nature to mean biodiversity and natural systems, but we are aware that we have an international audience, that term can mean so many different things to different people. When you joined me on this project, we had long conversations coming from humanities backgrounds about the books that we'd read that had problematized and complicated our understandings of what nature means, how we relate to nature. For me, that was someone called Timothy Morton, in particular a book called Ecology Without Nature. Perhaps his most intriguing argument is that whenever we fall back on kind of aestheticization in simplistic positive terms, we actually do a disservice to conservation and sustainability causes and how we think through ecology culturally. And for you put me onto a French anthropologist called Philippe Descola. The book you brought to the Prophets Wizards party was Beyond Nature and Culture. It's in a similar tradition of showing the impacts of the huge walls we conceptually put up between ourselves and the rest of the biosphere. And we could geek out on those guys, but we'll put more information about them in the show notes. Isabelle Dusson, the legal expert who we talked to at the end of the episode, actually name-checks Philippe, I think, in her interview. But we should also say that cultural conversation about how we relate to nature isn't just the province of niche academics and anthropologists who collaborate with Bjork, who could understandably be dismissed by some as pretentious, and who are known in certain circles. It's also a mainstream conversation. If you watch David Attenborough, and I know many people around the world do, you might have come into contact with this cultural conversation recently because David Attenborough and his producers were sort of taken to task for presenting nature in a kind of romanticized, aestheticized way, sort of playing into perceptions of nature as going on at a distance and not really being entangled with and impacted by us, by humanity. And the producers and his response was to, in one of the most recent series, to do an episode on biodiversity in urban areas and cities, and also to talk about humans' impact on the rest of the biosphere more often. So this is not an obscure academic conversation. This is fundamental to our lives and cultures everywhere.
I think that many of us love David Attenborough, especially now that he's available on Netflix in France. But we've got our very own Nicolas Hulot, who many young French people my age would have grown up with. He had his show called Ushuaïa Nature on wolves and nature on the screen. He later became the Minister of Ecology under Macron and then quit. That was dramatic.
Well, it's pretty dramatic that you guys have wolves. I mean, there's been some talk of trying to introduce those to Scotland, but it's exciting that you actually have that rewilding going on. But this hasn't just happened in and around David Attenborough. This is a conversation that's gone on within conservation movements around the world. Could you take us through that?
Let's think about wildlife conservation. A lot of people donate to wildlife conservation charities, and a lot of big philanthropic organizations are involved. And as we heard in episode 2, there is an increasing tendency to value our relationship to nature in financial terms, as natural capital. What underlies this shift is a philosophical transformation. There's this amazing 2016 article in Mongabay where journalist Jeremy Hans speaks about philosophical changes inside conservation groups. Essentially, they now value ecosystem services as a part of conservation. They're no longer just interested in nature reserves, charismatic species, or exotic habitats.
Really interesting, the shift you're describing in the conservation movement from almost a wildlife-centric approach to the realities of a human-centric one. A huge number of people in the UK, more than 8 in 10 children and young people, 85%, agreed that being in nature made them very happy. Those spending time outside at least once a week were more likely to report very high levels of happiness, and those who reported high connection to nature were the happiest. 1 in 6 children and young people, 60%, agree that they felt part of nature, compared to 58% of adults across the first year of a new survey. But it's all very well us feeling good about nature, us feeling part of nature, but what about accessing nature? How does that influence our experience and our interactions there?
It's something that governments around Europe have gotten increasingly interested in. The French Ministry of Ecology in 2020 did a new survey to try to get a sense of how many French people were actually getting out into nature every day. And that's 37% of the French population. That was much higher than what I expected. And it immediately made me wonder how much that's related to COVID. But also 39% of French people get to go into nature at least once a week, 16% at least once a month, and 9% less often or never. It's crazy to think about how that might shape someone's perspective on nature. But just to respond to what you were just saying about young people feeling a part of nature, here I read that according to that same study, young people under 25 in France are the ones who know the least about the natural world. So I wonder how knowledge relates to feeling there. It may well be that there's still quite a lot of disconnection, as well as feeling of connection towards nature.
Really interesting that you mentioned that kind of disconnection-connection fault line, because a lot of the thinking that we're doing in this episode is falling down that gap between nature as a friend and as a foe. Nature is something we can access and something we are part of and something we simply use, and that we are actually quite separate and quite distant from. Culturally, connecting with nature is at the heart of so many spiritual, psychological, literary ways of looking at life, and we're going to get into that. I remember studying a 14th century chivalric romance in Middle English, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. You would be interested in the French influences, the romance influences that it has. But the Green Knight is this enemy to Sir Gawain, who goes out from the Round Table at Camelot into the wilderness to fight the Green Knight. And the Green Knight represents the wildness of nature, and Sir Gawain has to keep his morality and the ethics of his civilized culture of Camelot, which are tested by contact with this wilderness.
Another year nearly gone already.
The audio you're hearing is from a new film adaptation.
You must seek him out.
Was it not just a game?
Perhaps. But it is not complete.
And we can even think about similar stories in films like The Revenant, which won Leonardo DiCaprio his first Oscar, or cowboy movies and the idea of pioneering central to American culture in general. I mean, for some reason, I was looking at the coat of arms of Indiana the other day. I think I was just going down a Wikipedia rabbit hole. And it's one of the most agricultural areas in the US. And the coat of arms is literally a woodsman chopping down a forest with a bison sort of running off into the distance. That is a celebration of a certain cultural idea of the woodsman and the pioneer. We love to idealize our triumphs over nature and our separateness from it, but also the idea of the wild and wildlife. Thinking about the way we view wildlife and coming back to foodlands, to farmland, where do farmers fit in all this? What role have farmers played in our relationship with nature? Where have they been on this spectrum of sort of idealization at one end and materialism at the other?
Environmental history is really helpful to think about this. Environmental historians would be the first to point to nature as the source of food and general human livelihood. They're pretty keen to point beyond culture, to the very materiality of what makes our lives possible. It's because I studied that I realized that someone in society always has to be touching nature in order to seed, to plant, to harvest, and in order to basically feed everyone. In turn, environmental historians will also take into account the fact that our culture always frames our interaction with nature in our food systems. For instance, many of you will be familiar with the organic movement and what it stands for around the world. In France, this movement has been on quite a political journey. There's this book called Organic Resistance, in which the environmental historian Venus Bivard describes how the birth of the organic movement in France was related to an anti-Semitic and racist ideology. It's quite crazy to think that some of the agronomists who first put the organic movement in place did it because they wanted the French soil to be as, quote-unquote, pure as the white French citizen. And for them, that meant a soil without any chemical input. The French organic movement was then appropriated by the left when caring for the environment became central to their preoccupations, and now I think it's fair to say that it's more and more mainstream. At least it's less politicized. Now people are looking beyond the organic movement and its accreditations towards blended approaches and practices like regenerative farming. Farming that simultaneously produces enough good food to feed the human population on Earth and tries to regenerate the Earth systems that will make food production and subsistence possible in the future. But that's a broad agenda. And who decides what regenerative farming looks like or what it means? Here, environmental historians would remind you that culture matters, and so does nature. And so, what specific kinds of culture will influence regenerative farming? Will it be techie or neo-hippie? Can it really produce the food we'll need while supporting biodiversity?
And we were really keen to get into the weeds of these issues with the experts we talked to for this episode. We wanted to ask, how has agriculture developed to estrange us from nature over time, and to allow for the current contribution of agriculture to environmental crises like the sixth extinction we're in, without being ungrateful for the huge benefits to supporting world population and food? The point you're always saying, which is we have to thank farmers first. And I think that's true. But is the answer to these damages to increase the legal rights that nature possessed? And in terms of land use, is the answer to these crises more estrangement, new high-tech industrialization and land sparing, setting aside land for wildlife? Or is it less estrangement, more biodiverse and sustainable farmlands generally? We have some great guests coming up who we tackle these topics with. We spoke to Ian Bradley, Emeritus Professor of Cultural and Spiritual History at the University of St Andrews, about how, particularly in the West, we have tended to culturally put nature on a pedestal or viewed ourselves as superior to it. He talks about animism, he talks about Christian ideas of stewardship, he talks about natural spas and health cures, all sorts of interesting ways of looking at our relationship to nature. We also did have some good conversations from other perspectives.
Yeah, we did, Theo, and we notably met Isabelle Dusson, who is the only legal expert and researcher on law at the French National Institute for Research on Agriculture, Food, and the Environment, which we call INRA in French. And she told us about how environmental law shapes what we have the right and what we don't have the right to do to nature. She spoke about how environmental law has also mostly ignored agriculture. Crazy, because agriculture in law, at least in French law and most European law, was considered like any other industry, any other polluter, basically. With Isabelle, we wondered whether it would be helpful to give rights to nature, as he mentioned, to make sure that societies develop farming practices that are more respectful to non-human beings. And she actually doesn't think that's a good idea. And she made instead a really interesting case for how the legal system can account for our diverse relationships to the natural world. We met Patrick Holden, who is a British organic dairy farmer and the founder of the Sustainable Food Trust, which works to break down the organic versus mainstream business and lifestyle divides in our food systems, and to make the whole thing greener and better for biodiversity. We spoke about his decision to become a farmer in the 1970s and how that related to the influence of the hippie generation and their love of nature. Patrick has been campaigning for sustainable food and farming ever since, with lots of personal experience shaping what he believes the role of the farmer in sustaining the natural world is. And I love the point that he made about the farmer as central to basically connecting to the natural world in the West, it was quite different from what Ian Bradley was talking about. Obviously, none of these guests are going to declare themselves as explicitly wizards or prophets. We'll leave that up to you to decide.
I think it was in a conversation with Rob Brooker last week where he said, what about the thank you moment? Because if you think about the history of farming since World War II, especially in a landscape like the French landscape, first of all, the question was, can you please feed us? With this imperative coming from the hunger that was suffered by French people in the 40s and in the 50s. And they answered to this imperative. And we've just moved on so quickly to realize that they've caused a biodiversity crisis that we forgot to say, thank you, you nailed it. We have cheap food, you know?
I think that's true. And I think that, after the Second World War, it was 2 blades of grass where one grew before and nitrogen fertilizer was there because of the Haber-Bosch process and explosives and all that kind of thing. And so and then there, in the UK, we had the 1947 Agricultural Act. And then later, when we joined the European Union, we had all those incentives. You really can't blame the farmers for responding to that. And I think a lot of farmers are really confused at the moment. They think, well, we did it, and now we're demonized. So yeah, we have to have empathy for their position. That's a starting point. But I do think we've gone very wrong. Obviously, in the year when we bought this farm, which is 73, I remember looking at the English landscape in particular and realizing that the whole thing was artificially colored as a result of chemical fertilizers. It was kind of bright green, bluey greens of all those grain crops that are heavily fertilizers and then sprayed. And I just saw it was kind of deeply wrong. It was an instinctive thing. It violated an aesthetic about which I'd had a taste in the 50s when I was growing up on this big estate in Hertfordshire. Quite quickly, we realized we couldn't make a living on conventional markets because the price, all the farmers around us were using lots of chemicals and stuff, and they were all subsidized. And we were trying to do something completely different, and we couldn't make it work. I mean, we did make it work. We were just producing less food, and the price wasn't right, which kind of was why I and others got involved with setting up the organic standards. It was like a means of survival in an economic environment which was harsh towards regenerative and sustainable farmers.
The organic standard changed everything. I mean, still to this day, in the way that we think about the food we consume. Most of the landscape that we even consider wild or that we consider to be nature is concretely being farmed. It feels like in our minds, in the general public, we've dissociated the idea of conservation, which is very tightly linked with charismatic exotic species, and then the idea of farming, which is related to the supermarket and what we eat.
I think you're completely right.
Do you think that concretely this biodiversity conservation and regeneration can happen on farmland? And what do you think it will take?
You describe the story of a separation, a kind of fall from farming in harmony with nature and producing food alongside nature to a complete separation of the two, not just physically and economically, but in our imaginations. So in the imagination of a child growing up today, you still might have some storybooks about farms where it's all lovely and there's still nature. But in reality, that no longer exists on most farms. And I think that the saddest thing of all, I'm not sure that this is completely true right across the European Union, but it's certainly true in relation to the UK Climate Change Committee. Their strategy for the future of UK agriculture is a land sparing, in other words, exactly what you've described, continue to separate nature from food production, in more intensification, sustainable intensification, which is probably an oxymoron, on the best land, leaving more land for rewilding and kind of stewardship schemes. So it perpetuates the separation and makes it even more difficult, would make it even more difficult for farmers to farm in harmony with nature. And it's the people who are the architects of kind of how we address climate change. They don't get this stuff. They don't believe it's possible to produce food, enough food, farming in harmony with nature to feed us all. Worse than that, they even believe that the separation of food production from nature is the best strategy. And that still, I reckon that thinking is prevalent all over the world. We're in a really serious situation. I'm sure you'll know about this study. There was a German nature reserve study where they looked at insect populations over the last 25 years. And it's declined by 75%, even in the German nature reserves. So this strategy will not work if we want to preserve nature and farm separately from nature. The decline in biodiversity and the sixth extinction will continue. So unless we manage to persuade the policymakers that they've got it wrong, and you can farm in harmony with nature and produce enough food, we're heading towards a planet which is going to be very difficult to live on. My answer, tentative, is that human beings, animals, farm animals, and plants, and wilderness, rainforest, it all plays some sort of mediating role between the mineral matter of planet Earth and the finer energies of the cosmos. And I feel that is the higher responsibility of the farmer. Stewardship, not just obvious stewardship, but some sort of spiritual stewardship. And I think that we've gone a long way from that through no fault of the farming community. I think in their hearts, nearly all farmers would like to feel that sense of harmony with nature. And I think we need to create the conditions where that's possible, because otherwise we won't be able to address climate change and restore biodiversity.
And I feel like you have dedicated your life not only to farming, but to trying to make these conditions possible for farmers to be able to access this cultural and spiritual dimension of the work that they do. Do you ever feel yourself like you're some sort of conduit between conduit? I don't know how to say that in English, actually. Between farmers. It's in French. It's the same pronunciation.
Oui.
Conduit.
Oui.
Conduit. Between farmers and more removed stakeholders.
I think I feel sometimes a kind of bridge role, but I think it's really important to meet all human beings on the level one finds them. It's disrespectful to meet a farmer who's been farming very intensively for 50 years and kind of to challenge what they're doing in a rude way. If one can put oneself in the place of another and understand their situation, that's a beginning. So if you meet somebody who's farming very intensively, I think the worst thing you can say to them is you're trashing the planet. Much better to say to them, you've been following the policies of the Common Agricultural Policy, which has been misguided for various reasons, and you're trying to stay in business and you haven't got a day job like me, and you follow the money. And for most farmers, that's the reality. And you probably made a pretty good job of staying in existence, doing the best you can to produce as much food as possible, which is what you've been told to do. But now we're all realizing we're on a treadmill and we've contributed towards climate change. And then you can see the relief, because if a farmer feels that they haven't been doing something really bad, in their heart, they probably would like to farm more harmoniously. And I think that if you then say to them, look, if somebody, governments and others gave you enough money to change the way you farmed, they'd go, yeah, I'd love to do that. And I really think most farmers are ready for that now. So I think that if that's what you mean by a conduit, maybe, yeah, I think also if I have a talent for doing that, it's because I'm bridging two worlds, because I have had the privilege of farming, but at the same time, I've had other influences on me. So maybe I'm a bridge communicator.
And I think that I wonder whether that question ties into the demographic change that's going to be happening in the UK and in the EU. I mean, I was just reading that I think it's 4 million farms in 10 years. That's 1/4 of European farms have disappeared in the past 10 years. And we're looking at 1 in 2 farmers retiring in the next 10 years in the EU. That's very hard to imagine that landscape. What's going to be the turnover? Sometimes I find hope in this new generation, and sometimes I wonder, who are they? Who's actually going to become the new European farmers?
Well, that's such a good question, because, I have felt ever since, I got back to the land from London with my communards, when we first arrived here, I can remember seeing, it was a bit like, as I've said before, Britain's California, West Wales, like Brittany, arguably. It's kind of, you go west to where there's, freedom and beauty and wild places. And that's what brought us here, that plus cheap land. But I remember when we arrived here, we were looking for other people like us who kind of moved, set up kind of community farms and that kind of thing. There were loads of people here, and I felt that common consciousness. And, I was at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1971, and there were 500,000 people there. And it was an amazing sense of kind of collective shift of consciousness, which was going on all over the planet. And you kind of felt a sense of common identity. It's a spiritual response, a movement of change. And between then and now, I haven't really felt that the generations which followed, because you could say I'm now old enough, but to have been like 2 generations. But now I feel that's different. So now I feel that young people today, not all young people, of course, it wasn't all young people in the 70s, but there was or the late 60s. But I feel there's a consciousness shift going on amongst young people, which is happening all over. It's intuitive, it's collective, it's happening at scale, and that gives me enormous cause for optimism. And I think the question is, how does that manifest in relation to people who get back to the land of your generation, not mine? And how can that be allowed and enabled by the retiring farmers? And it's relevant to me as well, because, what's my succession plan?
I do really admire that. And just for a little bit of context, I've come out of 1 year of living on a commune, and I was living at the ZAD, so in France, which is an opposition movement to an airport project. I do think that, founding communities that are in favor of something would be the ultimate power.
There was an awful lot of what we were trying to do, which was right. It was perhaps naive, and the conditions were somewhat different then to what they are now. But I think the difference between then and now is that whereas a lot of what we were aspiring to do was absolutely right then, now it's not just right, but there's almost a mainstream consensus emerging that it's not just right but essential to maintain the planet as a place where people can live in anything like the numbers that we have at the moment. So I think the conditions are radically different from how they were when we arrived here, which means that those people who share a sort of vaguely similar consciousness to what we've been discussing, you should feel that you no longer got to be against anything, because people are thirsting to be inspired by a new consciousness, but also that consciousness transferred into practical action in a way which is kind of functional and viable. And I think the big challenge of our time is to co-imagine and co-evolve an environmental, social, cultural, economic model which can replace the one we've got at the moment. And I do think that the doors will open to anybody who shows leadership or vision and isn't too angry, because I think we don't need to be angry anymore. It's clear that the system, which has predominated for the whole of my farming lifetime, has failed. And even normal mainstream farmers know that now. We need to not be overconfident, because obviously it's really hard to make these things work. And we've got to co-evolve a new decentralized models of farming systems and getting food to people who want to buy it as local as possible. All the things that need to be done. They're right at the limits of the technical, economic and imaginary capacity of us all, but they have the decisive advantage that there's no alternative, and unless we make it work, there are very tough times ahead.
I agree with you. I do want to push just a little bit further on this question of realization. And you mentioned that even conventional farmers are realizing that their model is broken. And I would go as far as to say that some of them suffer psychologically and economically grave consequences for the model that they've been put in, which is why we have such high suicide rates in the sector.
Yeah.
Yet, they're unable to change. Like they're often in high amounts of debt, and the system itself is not changing. Where are the obstacles there, specific to this sector, so that we're not addressing philosophically the size of life and change that can happen, but just there in that sector, how do we not have anger, and where do we begin to enact change?
There are two kinds of anger, it seems to me. There's anger which is violent and uncontrolled, and there's anger which is a legitimate response to what has happened. We're emotional beings, and how can we not, you, especially your generation, not feel that, you know, the planet has been violated and now you're having to step onto the stage and pick up the pieces. And, you know, the violation was caused by a generation who went before you, who didn't wake up to what needed to happen in time. So I think that could be a cause for anger. But I do think very few reasonably sentient people would challenge, you know, the statement that we're in a really deep hole at the moment and we've got to act very quickly to get out of it. The other thing I'd like to say about kind of what you've just raised is that, and all the people who are demoralized and can't change, is that I think that the ecological crisis is also a spiritual crisis. You know, Rudolf Steiner described animals as the soul of a landscape. I think there's a loss of meaning and a sense of connectivity of human beings right across the planet right now. And I don't believe that the right response to the ecological crisis is only material. It has to come from some deeper level. And I think it's interesting. I heard on the news today, the Radio 4 news, that there was actually mention of meditation and mindfulness instead of drugs for treating, you know, depression and mental diseases, which are so prevalent today, especially in the farming community. And I do believe that unless the actions that come from your generation are more centered from a place of inner connectivity, of a fusion of one's physical, emotional, and intellectual centers, from which I think better action, more becoming action can come. The actions that we take, they're just changing to, you know, organic farming, regenerative farming, whatever. If they're just material actions, they won't reach what's needed. So I think we have to work on ourselves, not just on the outer world, to bring about the change that's necessary. Unless all farmers transition in one way or another, we probably won't have a livable planet, because farmers and farming cover most of the land's habitable surface area, which isn't cities and roads and other stuff. It's no longer, you know, pristine wilderness. So we have to be thinking inclusively, not exclusively, about the change that's required.
Do you think that there's still this division in the farming sector between farmers who are conventional and who look at organic farmers who are tackling crises like the biodiversity loss crisis? Do you think there's still that division, and the conventional farmers are looking at the others as having taken some kind of lifestyle choice? And you think that
there's a bit of that still, but much, much less. You know, there's going to be a few fossils out there, aren't there? You know, but not, I think, so many fewer than there were. In relation to organic farming, we're still certified organic farmers here. In fact, we're the longest established organic dairy farm in Wales. But I think this idea of, you know, saying organic is right and all other farming is wrong polarizes the farming community. And just because it looks as if, quote, you could say that the organic farmers were right, I don't think it helps to say that sort of thing. There you are, told you so. You know, we've been going whatever number of decades, and now you've got to come over to us. I think that's exactly the wrong kind of attitude to have. I think we need to, as I was saying earlier, be more empathetic to the people who didn't switch to organic farming, and find a language and an attitude which is much more inclusive. And I guess that was connected with the formation of the Sustainable Food Trust. And interestingly enough, before I left the Soil Association, I kind of lost an argument with some of the people who were there, because I said I thought this whole thing about organic, which was never really in Lady Eve's mind when she set up the Soil Association in 1946, was too kind of focusing just on a brand and on a thing, and in fact, we needed to understand the issues better and be more inclusive. And anyway, so I left the Soil Association and set up the Sustainable Food Trust. And I think behind your question, how much can the large retailers, food companies and farmers be part of this transition? Or is it, conversely, something which can only happen from completely disruptive cells of the kind that sounds like you've been living with on your commune, who are kind of saying the orthodox, we've got to get rid of capitalism, all that sort of stuff, and Colin Tudge, who's set up the Oxford Real Farming Conference, he's kind of that persuasion. He thinks this neoliberal economy has got to die, and he doesn't even want big food companies on the stage, I don't think that's right. I think if we sell out, of course, that's not right. But these people, the people who are running all these big food companies, all the big farms, they're human beings. They've probably got children who are calling their parents fossils. We need everyone to be part of this. So, I just think we have to be inclusive in this. And that doesn't mean to say that we sort of throw out intellectual rigor. We can be really challenging of big food companies. But yes, I think the Sustainable Food Trust kind of DNA is to try to work with people, not against people, and find ways of measuring sustainability, which is for all food producers, not just organic ones. And, if you look at our organic inspection, which the system I helped design, every year we get inspected by the Soil Association. The inspectors come, one for the cheese, one for the farm. They spend a whole day on the farm looking to see if we're cheating. And I just think there's something really deeply depressing about that. What I really want to know is whether I'm making progress in the soil, my water, biodiversity, everything, to making the farm more sustainable and regenerative and everything. And that current certification system doesn't tell me that. And, in a way, we want some sustainability auditing system, which is completely inclusive of all farms. And then we can have a language which brings us all together.
You faced some criticism, but also some wonderful praise over the years for not being afraid to think exactly in this kind of big picture and in terms of culture, not just in terms of economics and technology, which allows you to have these kinds of big picture statements when it comes to farming and policy. And I think that maybe today momentum is picking up pace behind more interdisciplinary and more cultural approaches to the agricultural transition. Philosophers in France a lot are recognizing the role that culture plays, even if it's not articulated explicitly when we think about farming systems. And I read recently in the very mainstream Dairy Farmer magazine that the industry is concerned with examining their quote unquote social license to farm. Do you think that there is a shift in perspective?
I think there's absolutely a necessity for people involved with, for instance, dairy farming to do exactly that. And I think they are, which is what's even more interesting. So if you take Arla, who are one of the biggest dairy co-ops in the world, farmer-owned dairy co-op based in Denmark, they are, along with, I think, just about all big food companies and retailers, are quite worried. Not that I'm against people who have ethical objections to eating livestock products. Of course, I respect that. But I think if you don't have ethical objections, and if your objections are mainly environmental, then I don't think necessarily switching to plant-based milks is, well, it shouldn't be the only solution, but it becomes the only solution if all the big companies that are selling the dairy products have not considered this baseline of a social license to farm. And I think that certainly, I know that Arla are doing that because they've just rewritten their standards. And in that, probably the same magazine that you read, the dairy farming magazine, British Dairying, well, the one I read anyway, is basically saying exactly that. We have to listen to the people who are giving up drinking milk or dairy products because they think the system behind milk is industrial and a horrible story. And they're not entirely wrong. So I think really everybody who's in the business of farming or producing or selling food today needs to ask that question. and try to make sure that you can answer it, I can answer it, we can answer it in a better way.
The presenting sponsor of the Foodland season is the Framework Project, an EU-funded project helping localities to value biodiversity in our food system.
Clearly, if you look at the primal attitude to the natural world in the earliest cultures and civilizations, we can see there is, of course, a lot of animism where the spirits are seen to dwell in lakes, rivers, and trees and forests and mountains. And of course, aspects of that find their way into Eastern religion. If we take the Semitic religions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, which of course have a huge amount in common, you get something rather different happening, because you get the idea of a God, a creator, who is to some extent standing outside creation. Although there is within all these traditions, and perhaps particularly in Christianity, you see it in areas like Celtic Christianity, a doctrine of panentheism, not pantheism, which would be the primal sense that, as it were, God is in everything and everything is God, but an idea that God is in all creation.
So how does this play out within the cultural legacy of Christianity in the West? You've written a book called God is Green, Christianity in the Environment. Could you talk us through the journey of that cultural legacy?
Most of my work has been on Christianity and the environment, and in particular looking at the way that the green movement has, I think, very understandably seen Christianity as one of the problems because of its attitude towards the natural world, summed up in the early chapters of Genesis, where, God tells Adam that he and Eve have dominion over the beasts of the land and the fish of the sea, and the whole notion that Christianity is basically saying it's absolutely fine for humans to dominate nature. Then there is the whole doctrine of the fall, and the idea that in Christianity nature is fallen, and therefore in some senses we can do what we like with it. And there's also the view that Christianity has a very distant God who's not really very connected with what's going on in the world that God has created. And what I've really sought to do is to challenge these three positions, which I think are the positions that the church, to a large extent, took up, certainly from the Middle Ages onwards, and to some extent encouraged by the Reformation, and say that they're actually completely antithetical to what is in the Bible, where you have, I would argue, a very clear sense of humans as just part of creation, and not necessarily even the most important part. If you look at the Psalms, often we are just slipped in at the end. There's a real sense that God is concerned with all of creation, that we are, as I say, just stand alongside other parts of it. There is a real sense that God is intimately involved with the natural world, the whole created order. And you can interpret, of course, the doctrine of the fall in various ways, including to suggest it has a very ecological message, that actually the reason why Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden is because, as it were, they're not working with nature, they're seeking to dominate it, they become little gods themselves. So I'm interested in the whole way that Christianity and indeed other faiths have seen the natural world.
That's really interesting that you mentioned the little gods idea, and that there's almost a dual element of stewardship being a gift, but also some kind of curse. And I'm just interested in how that idea, that concept of stewardship, the cultural legacy of that, how it's kind of moved into movements like the environmentalist movement and so on. Did you explore that when you were writing your book?
Yes, I mean, as you say, there's a sort of imperative to be stewards. If you go back to what God says to Adam and Eve, and that word which is translated dominion so often in English translations of the Bible, when you actually look at the Hebrew word, it has much more connotations of kingly rule and stewardship, benevolent attitudes towards the rest of creation. And it has indeed been interpreted in that way throughout the Western tradition. A number of Christians, often rather, one would have to say, on the fringes, people like the Diggers in the 17th century, Gerard Winstanley and the whole Digger movement, who very strongly had this sense that we were called to steward the land and to sort of work with the land. There have obviously been a whole lot of ecological movements who've been inspired by Christianity and indeed by other faiths and more recent faiths like Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy and other faiths. But yes, I think you could say that there's been a tradition of emphasizing stewardship, going, of course, with a tradition of humans as being the gardeners of creation, and you can relate that back to Christianity. I mean, the Christian story starts in a garden, the Garden of Eden, and it ends in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is crucified, and the image of the garden. And of course, when Jesus rises from the tomb, Mary Magdalene, who sees him, thinks he is the gardener. So there's a very strong image of the garden and gardening throughout the Christian story. And I think that's been picked up. Poems and hymns within the broadly Christian tradition see us as gardeners and gardeners of creation.
All day working happily down near the stream bed, the light passing into the remote opalescence it returns to as the year wakes toward winter, a season of rain in a year already rich in rain, with masked light emerging on all sides, in the new leaves of the palms quietly waving. Time of mud and slipping, and of overhearing the water under the sloped ground, going on, whispering as it travels, time of rain, thundering at night, and of rocks rolling and echoing in the torrent, and of looking up after noon through the high branches to see fine rain drifting across the sunlight. Over the valley that was abused and at last left to fill with thickets of rampant aliens, bringing habits but no stories under the mango trees. Already vast as clouds, there I keep discovering, beneath the tangle, the ancient shaping of water, to which the light of an hour comes back as to a secret. And there I planted young palms, in places I had not pondered until then. I imagined their roots setting out in the dark, knowing without knowledge. I kept trying to see them standing in that bend of the valley, in the light that would come.
W.S. Merwin, What is a Garden? One of my favourite poets, who speaks the language of conservation and was a conservationist, influenced by Buddhism and the Psalms that he was read by his Presbyterian minister father growing up. A huge amount of his poetry is exploring how we culturally relate to nature. Why is it, thinking about your work writing on water and pilgrimage, why is it that things like rivers have such cultural power for us if we ended up with more places that were wilder than they are now? Do you think we might actually be more culturally equipped in terms of, in the West, the results of our history so far?
If in some senses food manufacture becomes more industrialized and more scientific and perhaps hived off from the land to some extent, then, as you say, do we see more rewilding of the land? Do we see more human interaction with wilderness? I think that that does open up possibility. Thinking of water and the work I've done on the spiritual dimension of water, it's always been seen, of course, in all religions as hugely important. Now, that's partly because of the fact we can't live without water. I mean, as we know, we can live actually longer without food than we can without water. And water is such an important constituent of our physical being. There's the flow of water, the fact that it is constantly moving, and yet it can, of course, also be dammed and it has a durability. There's the whole debate about whether water has a memory. Water is traditionally associated with spirits departing after death down into the sea, the whole significance of oceans and ocean depths. If we have a wilder landscape, it may give us a greater spirituality. It may give us a greater engagement with the natural world in a way that perhaps does take us back to a more primal age and culture and encounter. I think that is perhaps a kind of hopeful scenario for the future.
How might that sit within cultural history? Do you see it as part of a trend of greater aestheticization or idealization of nature, as most of us became more distant from it during periods of greater industrialization and urbanization of our societies?
If you look at kind of the way Western society has developed, in parallel has gone a kind of scientific movement and ever, pushing the boundaries so that things which would have been thought of as inconceivable 100 years ago, I don't know, air travel or the kind of communication we're having through the ether and computers now is commonplace. And so we push the boundaries scientifically, but at the same time, going in tandem with that is, if you like, the kind of romantic movement. We go back to the 18th century when, in a sense, the sort of birth of modern science in many ways and the birth of the romantic movement. And I don't know if they are necessarily incompatible or disassociated. They appear to be sort of taking you in different directions, but in some senses they are about the human spirit adapting to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And so I could see a kind of synthesis in a way between what you're talking about, where food production becomes, as you say, much more scientific and intensified, and therefore producing much less of a carbon footprint. Then your retreat to nature and to this increasing use of the natural world for enjoyment and wildness. I could see those having a kind of symbiotic relation, but obviously at the moment it's very inequitable in terms of who has access to nature and who doesn't, and just as it's very inequitable about who has access to clean water. And this is precisely why the spas of Europe take off in the 18th and 19th century, and they are presented as utopias, rural oases where you're going to have a healthy life, you're going to commune with nature, and much is made of the scenery as well as the waters and also of the company, and in some senses it's very elitist, and it's for the rich and the powerful, and the aristocracy and monarchy go off there. Then in the 19th century, to some extent, it reaches the bourgeoisie, and in the 20th century, in the communist countries of Eastern Europe, of course, it does actually reach the workers, because one of the interesting things about the development of spas in Eastern Europe is that they become the playgrounds of the workers, and trade unions and the state send people off from their factory lives to have 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks in a spa. But it's absolutely, as you describe it, it's getting away from the increasingly urbanized life and the pressurized life that many people have to a quieter, more healthy existence. And you get, particularly in the 19th century, the development of very interesting philosophies by people like Vincent Preisnitz in what was then Silesia on the Czech-Polish border, the development of hydrotherapy, the origins really of natural medicine, really extolling the benefits of fresh air, simple food, no drink, no smoking, no stress insofar as you can get this, and you get this whole natural health movement arising, and of course taken up very widely in the 19th century and in our own times. But I think you're absolutely right. It's the cultural background is an increasing awareness, it's an increasing urbanization, increasing stress, and you can see exactly how the spas relate to this, and wellness, not always called that, but various things as a kind of alternative. You can see the whole development of the wellness industry now in the context of increasing levels of stress and urbanization. So it's a very similar thing.
I'm really curious what you think this might mean for the farmer as not just a practical, technological sort of cross point between humanity and nature, but also a cultural one. What might this mean if farming becomes more industrialized and this sort of story of cultural abstraction continues?
I mean, if we go back to the kind of paradigms of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's obviously an agrarian society. It's a relatively recent agrarian society where the move from hunter-gatherers to more settled agriculture is relatively new. The figure of the farmer, the person who is working with the land, tilling the land, is absolutely central. And you've only got to think of Jesus's parables, about the sower sowing. It's a kind of central feature of culture and society, and it's an agrarian society. That has tended to be the norm virtually ever since. I mean, the Industrial Revolution obviously changed it, and obviously the numbers of people involved in farming is infinitesimal now in the West and a country like Britain to what it used to be. But it's still clearly the norm in many other countries. The implications of what is happening now are very considerable. If we're going to move to much more, not even industrialized food production, but as I say, food production in the laboratory, and we're seeing it obviously already, is the way to get out of meat eating, and we'll be all eating that in decades to come, then it has huge implications. The farmer ceases to be this central figure. Working with the earth perhaps becomes much less important.
Alors, moi, j'ai abordé la question de l'agriculture et l'environnement. Je vais vous donner le titre de ma thèse, donc qui date de quelques années.
I will give you the title of my thesis that dates back a few years ago, which was Agriculture and Environmental Law, the Impossible Reconciliation, with a question mark. So the question I was asking myself was, how does environmental law take ownership of the agricultural issue? And I saw that, in fact, environmental law was built around this issue of industrial pollution. That is to say that environmental law makes a big distinction between pollution of an industrial nature and what is called the protection of nature, where we operate more on specially protected species and spaces where human activities are very reduced. Seen in the natural park phenomenon, for example, that we find in all countries, we can clearly see that there is agricultural pollution. That's obvious. With pesticide, with nitrates, for example, it pollutes the water, the soils, reduces biodiversity. In my initial thesis that dates back over 20 years, my thesis was to say that largely an industrial legal regime has been applied to agricultural activities. We have a law in France that is very old because it dates back to 1810, and that deals with classified industrial installation for the protection of the environment. It has always taken care of the most of the polluting installation and those that present risk of explosions, for example. And farms are included in this body of rules. So we're going to treat livestock like we're treating a chemical production activity, if you like. You see, we apply the same type of rules. At that point, we already have our agriculture, which is still in a very industrial pattern. We have our long-standing environmental law, with its industrial approach, and as a result, we find ourselves with pollution that's very similar to industrial pollution. And in fact, that is not okay, because we are reinforcing a phenomenon of industrialization. The environmental issue is seen as something completely external to agricultural activity. Economists will talk about externalities, you see, and what I'm saying is that environmental issues of living things are not external to agricultural activity. And so I have been directing my research from the beginning in this direction, trying to make environmental law applied to agriculture more inclusive than it is for industrial pollution. And evolution means that finally we can adopt, including regarding agricultural industrial activities, a much more complex vision of the environment than it was the case 20 or 30 years ago. Agricultural activity has a much more ambiguous relationship with environmental issues and with natural resources. Agriculture is not quite an industrial activity like any other because, first of all, it is an activity that produces living things, whether plant life or animal life.
Où en est aujourd'hui le droit? J'ai presque envie de dire le droit agricole.
That makes me wonder exactly where this law is at today.
Si on devait faire un état des lieux.
Where are we at?
What I find interesting for the last 10 years, not much more, is that we're starting to embrace the idea as, it was what I was telling you, the environmental issue is not limited to the protection of certain areas and species on the one hand, and prevention of pollutions on the other. We're starting to take a little more functional vision of the environment. We are now talking about ecological functions. We are also talking about ecological services. For example, in France, we have what we call the green and blue frames, which are in fact spaces where it is a matter of organizing the transition between several environments. So we realize that ecological functioning is much more complex than we wanted to imagine, and above all, what was included in the law. The law is still a system where legal certainty is needed. We need to know what rules are going to be applied. We have categories. We need to know, is this a protected species or not? A species, by the way, can be harmful or not. So we operate category by category, a bit fixed as the natural science was in the previous century. In France, we have local authorities, we have communes, departments, regions, and we have the state. And not all of them have the same skills. So we have barriers which make it sometimes difficult to organize this issue of environmental governance, with overlaps and borders that sort of explode. And as I mentioned, agriculture is good ground, both for researchers, but also in terms of environmental policy. For example, it is very interesting to see in these agroecological services, where farmers are paid to provide collective services. There is this form of recognition of more complex situations. That's where we're pretty much at.
He wrote with Daniel Magda and the legal expert Sarah Van Uxem an article called Useful or Sensitive Nature? The Two Paths Towards the Socio-Ecological Transition. Describe to us the types of law that flow from a perception of nature as useful or as sensitive, and maybe why you also choose to oppose these two paths.
First, you ask me the question of an example of a utilitarian approach to living things. So we have plenty, of course, and especially on the agricultural issue. Since animals, for example, are really what we call goods, objects that are things to which right apply in the first instance, obviously the right of property. We are obviously fulfilling a vision of a utilitarian exploitation of these resources, whether animal or vegetables, as long as we have property rights to it. But on the other hand, in the French law, we find in other legislation the notion of animal sensitivity. Animal sensitivity emerged in the French law in the mid-70s, which were very rich years for environmental law. It is integrated into codes, in particular the Civil Code in French law, again in 2015. And so this question of animal sensitivity is interesting because it brings our attention to the fact that the animal or plant is property. It's true, that's correct, but it's not a situation quite like any other because it's something that is sensitive and therefore open to change, to physical and psychological suffering. And so as a result, the law has to take this into account. So I will give you some examples on the question of sensitivity of plants. And in fact, with intellectual property, look up the question of seed sensitivity. It's very clear. It's true in French law, but it's also true in international law. The idea here is that we really consider plants, or in particular seeds, as inanimate objects in an industrial way, objects on which we apply property rights and intellectual property rights, and in particular, one of the characteristics of the intellectual property rights are that the object of intellectual property must be the same over time. Now, there is another reality in the legal question of agricultural production, and that is that seeds and plants in general must also be able to evolve according to the environments in which they are located, according to the climatic condition, for example, to which they are subjected, or the soil, etc. We have to take advantage of or exploit these evolutionary capacities to have a more effective breeding results. And here, in fact, this reality is beginning to be reflected in legal terms. The term sensitivity may not be quite suitable for plants, but in law, regardless, there is the idea that plants adapt. They're not inanimate objects in a way. And so here, finally, the evolution of the law in recent years has consisted of, in particular in regards to intellectual property law, to try precisely to have this adaptative capacity of plants recognized. And also, above all, we must not forget the work of farmers working to allow this evolution of plants in different environments. So here we can say that suddenly, from a legal point of view, we have a recognition of the plant as a being or as a population that can evolve, for example. And finally, this sensitivity and this recognition of sensitivity in law, it comes to say that there are limits to the legally recognized powers that humans have over animals. And these limits and borderlines are linked precisely to this question of animal sensitivity. If I harm an animal, if I torture it, for example, or if I inflict it on unnecessary suffering, there are prohibitions. And then there are at the same time what are called animal welfare standards that apply in professional condition and especially farm animals. Within this context of raising animals in general to kill them, there can be no relations to other than economic relation. And so, for example, we have a system in France for compensating farmers whose herds have been decimated by a wolf, for example. While in this system of compensation, we do not recognize at all any compensation for the emotional or moral damage that the farmer may feel that is quite real. Studies show this very well, actually. Breeders live very badly with the discoveries of their mutilated animals. It's invisible to the law. But recently, we have in French law an example of a rule that can go into a slightly different direction and that has served as an experimental ruling. This law relates to the slaughter of farm animals, when they're slaughtered for health reasons in particular. When farm animals are slaughtered, except for small animals such as poultry or rabbits, they are all slaughtered in slaughterhouses, and the farmer no longer have a hand on it. As soon as the animal enters the slaughterhouse, they no longer have contact with their animal. However, there are breeders who are experiencing bad effects from this state of affair. First of all, it is probably not easy to send animals to the slaughterhouse, some of which they have known for a little while, for example, cattle, large animals, and, they stay longer on the farm. It's been exacerbated by all the videos that have been put on the internet that show horrible things in slaughterhouses. Things farmers may usually not have to see. So these breeders suddenly would like to accompany the animal, including in these terminal phases, which obviously can be eminently stressful. And so here in France, for a few years, we have been experimenting with what we call slaughterhouses on the farm, or mobile slaughterhouses, where everything is done so that the animal does not have any stress, and that they do not understand, in fact, that they're going to be put to death, and therefore they cannot really feel stress. And the breeder keeps intact the bond they have formed with this animal until the end. So here we see how the law can account for sensitivity, can open up to relationship that can be a relationship of the emotional type when you are with a pet, with a farm animal. It's probably way more complex, I'm not sure if we can talk fully about an emotional relationship, but in any case, we can probably talk about a relationship of attachment to these animals. And in case, recognition on the part of the breeders of the animals as living being that suffers. So here are various examples to show you how the law can react.
Your answer was as wide as my question. It made me wonder, what if we stretch this thinking a little further beyond the legal recognition of the relationship between humans and non-human beings, and towards the legal recognition of animals and plants' personhood? Some legal systems around the world recognize the personhood of some mountains and some rivers. Can you tell us where this legal evolution stems from and what kinds of possibilities it opens up?
So, I have to tell you first that as a lawyer, personally, I am not in favor of recognizing a legal personality for non-humans. That's not necessarily the position for everyone, including lawyers. There are debates on this, but I will try to explain to you why I think like that, and also try to explain to you, as objectively as I can, of course, what the situation is based on in French law, but with also other examples. So already for my part, I am nevertheless making a difference between this question of sensitivity, which are indeed very closely related to the questions of being, existence or consciousness, and on the other hand, the question of legal personality. I still think that these two are different issues that are related, but they are still different, and they are also being treated different by the law. The question of legal personality arises in a slightly different way for animals and for elements of the environment. So when it comes to elements of the environment, it arose very early. It was the 60s, I think, when we actually had a North American academic who proposed recognizing rights of trees because they were redwoods in particular, which were in danger of being cut down in the United States. And there was no legal protection, so nothing forbade destroying them. And now this academic actually proposed that rights to his trees to be recognized for a completely operational, practical purpose. And that's the only solution he saw to protect these trees. In fact, it means recognizing rights for them, considering them as subject of law that we cannot destroy in this way. And so suddenly, this question was taken up later by others with a much more philosophical vision behind it, especially regarding animals. We've been talking about the animal question for a while now, particularly farm animals, but consider animals in general. Some of us are very close to us, so we must often think of the great apes. They're very, very close to us. So we don't quite understand why these non-humans, who are almost our cousins, why the law consider them as objects, as things to which we have rights, but they don't have rights. In any case, they do not have legal personality. There's a philosophical question behind it. It's not only humans that should be recognized as beings who can think, who can feel things, etc., like sentient beings. So for me, however, I still consider these two questions to be a little different. First, there is the issue of sensitivity, and I have given you a few examples where the law finally recognizes sensitivity without recognizing any legal personhood rights for animal. So clearly, environmental value is a value that is not fundamentally questioned. We find it in our national constitution, we find it in the law of the European Union. So it's really a value that is recognized by law. I consider that the practical aspect of recognizing personhood rights for nature in France and in our European country is a bad idea. It's not a practical path that is more efficient than what we're doing right now. In any case, it will always take a human who is going to represent his animals. Who gets to determine these rights when human rights are so difficult? I think there's a risk of bias that is really, in my opinion, damaging. The risk is that we open the category of subject of law. We open it to non-humans, but we are not opening it to all non-humans. For example, are mosquitoes or certain animals considered harmful or invasive plant species, for example? Will I recognize them as subjects of law? Where am I going to recognize microbes or airforms as a subject of law? Presumably not. So that means that we will have to put another diving line. Okay, and now what are we going to take as a criteria? It really complicates things. There is also a risk that seems very, very, very annoying to me, and that also has been the subject of study, which is to say. Finally, if we consider that non-human beings can be subject of rights, it means that the criterion for being a subject of law is not the simple fact of belonging to the human species. And so we will be able to consider that they are animals. I am thinking, for example, of great apes, who are much better able to have rights than some humans because they are smarter. They are able to make choices, etc. So now we're sort of opening a can of worms here. And finally, there is one last bias I find embarrassing with this theory and the debates that focus on the opposition between being a subject or being an object of law. It's that suddenly we completely ignore the question of human relation with non-humans, and I think that's where the most interesting things really are. It is precisely the relationship that we have with our environments, with animals that we see, the animal that we live with, etc. And that's what's interesting. If you say such animals are subject to personhood styles, rights, you do not ask yourself the question of the relation that you have with them. What is uniquely non-human about those relationships? So it doesn't make any sense anymore. And now I have to think it's embarrassing. Philosophical trends also show us this with, I'm thinking in particular of publication by Philippe Descola, but also people like Jean-Baptiste Morisot, on the question of relation with the environment and animals, or people like Catherine Larère who wrote about it. We are precisely tending towards the question of how can we decipher what we can understand, what we can highlight, the diversity of relationship we have with the environment and animals. Even in Western society, while we in the West are supposedly on a naturalistic type scheme, with a separation of nature and culture.
So according to you, as I understand it, it should not be our legal system's priority to give legal personality to non-human beings. So what should be its legal priority? What is the role of the legal system in the next 20 years? How can it both account for the very utilitarian realization that we receive benefits from nature and that we need to protect it as a provider of services, all the while safeguarding the diversity of relationships that us humans entertain with the natural world around us?
So we have a lot of progress to make right now. I have given you some examples of what are the rules that could be enacted to go in this direction regarding sensitivity and in a more general way on the issue of relationship with nature. You are right to point out the fact that we are all in a functional and I would even say really utilitarian approach. Well, that's a notion of ecosystem services. And then it's based on a kind of completely fictional idea, which is to say that nature provides us with services. And so I've always found amusing is that obviously, in fact, we're not in a relationship where you can say everything is good to receive from nature. Of course not. Think of natural disasters. And so in order to try to counterbalance and account for other type of relationships, we had to invent the notion of disservices. That is to say, cases where, indeed, nature does not render service to man. But in reality, the relationship is obviously much more complex than it simply provides me with services, or that I am dependent or not dependent on it. These are relationships that are truly part of human history. I mean, humanity has been shaped through this relationship with plants for food, for its habitation, ultimately for everything. Whether it's a relationship with plants or animals, we built ourselves with it. And so these are bonds that are the same type of bonds with affection, attachment, but also conflictual ones, of course, and relationships that exploit risk, fear. What I would like to say is that law is also vision. It's one way of seeing the world. I like to quote an article by Marie-Angèle Hermite who says, in a sense, law is another world. Law gives an image of reality, but it's an image that is reductive. And that the image we want to produce at a given moment in the evolution of our society. But on the other hand, not all life goes through legal representation. And luckily, there are also relationships that we have with nature that do not neatly fit into the current legal frameworks. We shouldn't think that law is a solution to everything. Far from it. But I'll try to finish on that. I think one of the ways it can be useful is to open it as much as possible, not to be closed, in fact, to any possibility, to any path, including ways that are utilitarian ways. Why not the notion of ecosystem services? It can be interesting because ultimately it also brings us back, paradoxically enough, into nature. It brings us, humans, back into the ecological processes.
So before we jumped into the interviews, Alexandra, you said we would let the listeners decide where our guests' ideas came in on the Prophet Wizard spectrum. But as ever on this series, I'm gonna force us to have a go ourselves. So listening to those interviews, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully we leave them the time to listen up and make up their own minds before we impose our view, but it feels like in this episode, the wizards were the ones who thought that we don't have to keep our old ancestral farming practices in order to continue enjoying and even connecting to nature. Ian Bradley really surprised me on that. He reminded us both about all the wonderful benefits of being in nature and the fact that they've been recognized since the dawn of time in literature and religious texts. He gave a really interesting perspective of how these joys have always become quite remote from our most productive farming systems, that we feed ourselves today without necessarily connecting to nature.
So would you say that Patrick Holden was our in-house prophet of sorts for this episode?
Yeah, the way I understood it is that for Patrick, humans need farmers to connect to their natural world, and farmers can play the privileged role of being this bond between human societies and their own local land. If farmers are properly accompanied to transition towards practices that both feed the world and shape beautiful and diverse rural landscapes, everyone could win. They seem to be the prophetic approach for me.
Thinking about winning and losing, the law loves winning and losing, and Isabel told us a bit about how when it comes to the intricacies of environmental law and tricky questions about sharing things like personhood rights with nature, the law tends to fall on different parts of the spectrum in different places and circumstances around the world. As always, if you're interested in finding out more about these questions or the work of any of the guests that we spoke to, please check out the show notes for links and for resources. We wanted to mention also that in certain podcast apps, you can use chapter headings to navigate these episodes.
How do you think all of this relates to our next episode coming up?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about the next episode as Patrick was describing the ideas of farmers considering their social license to farm. Next time, we're catching up with more people on the ground working with these changing social expectations of how farmers relate to nature.
Yeah, we're going to hear what it's like to farm successfully in a new context, with new incentives. Everyone's aware that we're in an age that we could call the Anthropocene, right? Where there's unprecedented human impact, global heating, and species extinction. We're going to hear what it feels like to be the people trying to feed us with all these new expectations.
And if those terms, any of the terms that Alexandra has just said, mean nothing to you, stick around for the last episode where we get more into the Anthropocene idea. But until then, thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Our Show is a podcast from Tascape Media, hosted by Alexandra George-Pico, who's also an assistant producer, and Theodore Simmons, who produces and edits the series. The production assistant is me, Beatrix Keeler. Alistair Simmons is our executive producer. Our thanks to all who've been involved in making the show possible.